It's episode 156 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Go visit hankgarner.com and browse through all of the archives of the show. Be sure to subscribe while you're there. Over in the right-hand sidebar, there's lots of episodes to go back and listen to. Get yourself up to speed and get some motivation for this new year. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors this week. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. My good friend Daniel Arthur Smith is the curator and the genius behind this series. The newest episode out so far is Tales from the Canyons of the Damned in Space, Volume 1. 4 authors, excellent stories, pulpy goodness with a space setting. There's another episode of Tales from the Canyons of the Damned in Space coming soon, and you won't want to miss that. Click on the link in the show notes. There's a banner there where you can pick up the whole series. If you loved reading pulp magazines and comics when you were a kid, this will definitely bring back those memories. Also, ThirdScribe.com. If you're an author and you're looking for a way to connect with readers, or maybe you're a reader and you're looking for a way to find new authors, or maybe connect with authors that you love, ThirdScribe.com is the place to do that. Go visit Rob and the folks and let them show you how readers and writers can truly come together. Also, Nick Cole brings his awesome book, Fight the Rooster, to us this week. Challenger for Best Read of the Year. Well worth a look. Amazing job, says Tim Ward, Hugo-nominated reviewer and host of the Sci-Fi Podcast. It's the story of one man's attempt to ruin his career in order to save his life. Part Catch-22, part The Player. Fight the Rooster is an eclectic, funny, and unpredictable thrill ride through life and Hollywood. Now stay tuned for this spot from Eric Totzi and his book, The Scout.
Change is inevitable. It's heading for Earth at 12,000 miles per hour, and it will land virtually undetected. For Jack McAllister, a young writer who has finally launched a career for himself, it begins tragically. His estranged father, a former NASA engineer, dies suddenly at his home in Meriwether, Indiana, leaving Jack's Alzheimer's-stricken mother a widow. But in the wake of personal heartbreak, he's confronted by an even more astonishing event: the covert landing of an alien machine in the forest just a few miles outside of town. Now Jack must unmask the true purpose of the otherworldly device that has begun a detailed environmental survey of the woods. Aided by the town's young and resilient female deputy sheriff, he soon discovers that the alien scout is only one small part of a much larger operation, and the countdown to a terrifying global catastrophe is about to take place. Drawing deeply from his father's scientific influence, Jack uncovers and ultimately finds himself an unwilling component of an alien plan set to terminate life on Earth as we know it. Crichton-esque techno-thriller with enough twists and turns to keep you turning those pages. The rural setting and the believable characters set this apart from the majority of alien invasion novels. Sci-fi365.net. The Scout by Eric Totzi, now available at Amazon.com.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to bring an author to you that is just absolutely killing it in urban fantasy, and that's a little pun there. But Richard Kadrey, the author of the Sandman Slim series that most of you will probably know him from, joins me today. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thanks. So I ask everyone the same question thereabouts at the beginning of each show, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer and or storyteller?
Wow. I remember I was very young, probably first grade, trying to write and illustrate my own science fiction stories. And they were always alien invasion stories back then. I remember writing, I think I got it like 9 pages, which is pretty good for like an 8 or 9 year old.
Heck yeah.
Story about giant crab aliens invading Egypt and fighting the alien crabs from the top of the Sphinx.
That's awesome.
So that's my earliest story memory right there.
Yeah. Did you show it to anybody?
I think my mom,
Yeah.
who found the whole thing amusing. My mother, my mother read my fiction and liked the fact I was writing. Certainly the fiction. She liked my. I started out as a journalist, really, when I started writing professionally, and she was fine with my journalism. But she only read my fiction up to maybe late teenage years. Like in my 20s, I started writing stuff that she found disturbing. So even though she supported me as a writer, when I started writing serious, what I consider my serious writing, she kind of gave up very quickly because she didn't like horror. She didn't like me writing horror, anything with violence in it. So she loved the crabs and the Sphinx, but she gave up probably around 16, 18 and didn't read anything ever again.
When things got a little too real?
Yeah, or dark. I mean, I think we both lived with violence in our lives, and the fact that I was writing about violence, I think she found disturbing. So, yeah. You can never know with other people, right? What it was exactly. But I don't think she liked the idea of her little kids thinking about these things.
Yeah. Was that subject matter something that always kind of intrigued you, or are you one of those people that kind of looks at the world through a different prism and comes up with these types of stories?
Probably. Yeah. When I was a kid, I know that I was deeply affected by visual art, and when I was very young, let's say 8 years old, maybe even 7, I saw my first Dali paintings.
Oh, wow.
In Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I just remember staring at them for what felt like hours. I'd never seen anything like them, and I was trying to understand them. And I couldn't do it, but they really, those couple of Dalis and seeing Duchamp's New Descending a Staircase, I honestly believe turned a switch in my brain at a very young age and made me see the world in a different way. I've never seen the world entirely, probably in realist terms. The closest thing ever to that, and maybe this is me trying to bring realism into my life, was when I was writing journalism. When I was doing like straight news and reviews and stuff like that. That was sort of like closest ties to the regular world, and the rest of it was just seeing the world through the eyes of the old Parisian surrealists, just looking at the world and tweaking it in different ways. And I've done that my whole life.
I definitely relate to what you're saying about when you engage with certain art, there is a switch that goes off where some people can walk by, see a painting like that and say, oh, that's pretty, that's intriguing, that's, whatever is your initial reaction, and keep walking. And another person sees it as a complete story, and will stand there and try to figure out what the painting is trying to say and what the artist is trying to convey. There's a difference there for sure.
Absolutely. And the fact you said story, what is the story being told in this painting? And I think it's a really good way to put it. A really good painting, like a really good photo, is going to tell you a story in a single frame. And trying to get that, trying to understand, especially in surrealist work, Dada stuff, Cubist works, trying to find that, understand that, especially when you're young, really affects, I think, the way you process information. And, I think it's going to give you a big decision. Are you going to stick with that the rest of your life? Is that switch going to stay thrown, or are you going to reject it and go back and, go back to a purely realist view of the world? And I'm quite happy that I stuck with, mine stuck the way it did.
The rest of us are too. And let's get back to that in just a minute. But at what point in your upbringing did you realize? I know you said that you went into journalism and you were pursuing fiction at the same time. But at what point did you know, I'm going to be a writer? This is something that this is going to be my career. This is who I am.
Again, that was very young. I'm one of those people who knew very young that I wanted to be a writer, and then it became a process of how do you become a writer and how do you make a living at it. And that's one of the reasons journalism was really good for me for a while. But I wrote a lot of stuff. I mean, I've written for 1 million websites. I've written advertising, which I'm not proud of, but I did that for a while for money. I've written some sites I can't talk about that would surprise people. I think would amuse some people. But again, it's a matter of learning that any writing experience is good experience. I think that's the thing. When you're starting out, if you want to be a fantasy novelist, all you want to write is that. But then along the way, if you just want to learn to write, anything anyone offers you is going to give you an opportunity to write. So writing film reviews and concert reviews and book reviews for people, even writing advertising. Advertising and journalism will both teach you to write, take dense information and make it very straightforward. Whether you're writing a campaign slogan for potato chips, you're trying to get across an idea, again, a story.
Right.
Or in journalism, when you're trying to tell a story in very simple sentences, very simple language. We were told when we were writing for newspapers, write for sixth graders. Don't get fancy. Don't use a lot of big words. You're writing for the widest audience possible. And learning to write those simple declarative sentences in news stories, I think was the best writing experience I ever had, much more than any kind of contemporary modern fiction class you can take, because learning to write simply and to get information across and to research things really helped me a lot. And then later on, I felt like, okay, we can apply the sort of literary things to this. But to get that grounding in simplicity and being able to tell a story in as few words as possible, I think really helped me. And I think could help a lot of younger writers. Don't just jump into your creative writing classes. Think about taking a journalism class either at the same time or maybe taking journalism before and then jumping into creative writing.
Yeah. And that'll really help you as a writer understand how to connect emotionally with your reader. What you could just tell a story of what happened today, or you could figure out a way to make it resonate with the readers. And that's utterly important when you go to writing fiction.
Absolutely. And learning to write a lead, if you want to grab the reader with that first line, that first paragraph, that's one of those things, you see in younger writers who, they want to write a fantasy novel. They want to, especially if they're going to write high fantasy, they want to write something like Tolkien. They'll do some endless prologue that will just stop. It's like, just stop any reader. It's like, I don't want to read 5,000 words about a world and characters I don't know anything else about. Just tell me the damn story. Learning to skip stuff like that, learning to grab readers, hold them, and then to fill in that information later as the story goes along. I don't know if they still use this term, but the narrative hook was the way I learned it. And I think it's probably a kind of a 50s term. I don't know if anybody uses that anymore, but the idea of grabbing people at the beginning and not letting them go, keeping their interest throughout, but making them want to know what happens next. That's same in journalism as it is in fiction.
Yeah, and it's a great term. I mean, a great phrase, narrative hook, because if it's not used anymore, we need to bring it back to in vogue for sure.
Yeah.
Did you read comic books when you were young?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
very much.
What were some of your favorites?
I was a real. Okay. I grew up in New York, and there was a real pecking order to a lot of this stuff. Everybody starts out reading DC, specifically Superman, right? Everybody had to read Superman. Then you can move on to Batman. Then there's and then you get to read some of the other DC characters, but you had to read both of those two. Then at a certain age, you were expected to become more mature, and you switched to Marvel. And you had to take these steps. So then, at a certain point, you switched to Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, and some of those comics. And this is expected. This was a rite of passage when I was young. And you had to do it, or you were just out of the loop. You were a freak. And I would sneak in other weird comics, some of the non-mainstream companies too. But as long as you read, and kept up with the contemporary comics, you were okay. But if it's the time you were still reading, when you were reading Spider-Man, if you were still reading Superman, there was something wrong with you. So you had to leave those things behind. And I think all my youth was reading superheroes, and now I really don't read superheroes at all anymore, unless someone specifically says, no, this story, this run of a particular story is really good, like the Dark Phoenix run on X-Men. I don't really care about X-Men, but everyone's saying, no, this is special. So to go back to superheroes in that way, if someone can point me to, that, Frank Miller's Dark Knight, stuff like that. But I don't really read superheroes anymore.
Well, once you encounter, especially like some of the Vertigo books, once you encounter Neil Gaiman's Sandman, it's hard to. Those are things that are hard to unsee, and hard to. Yep. It's kind of like a personal evolution that once you're there, you just can't go back home.
Well, seeing Sandman really changed a lot of things for me, because I was started out strictly as a science fiction writer. I had really very little respect for fantasy. I think partly because a lot of the fantasy I grew up with was epic fantasy, and everyone was just doing different flavors of Tolkien.
Right. That's
all it was. Once you read Tolkien, it was just like, oh, okay, what version of him are you telling? And I just didn't find it interesting. And then the rest of it was like, it was something like, oh, talking cats. Oh, great. You have cat people. That's really interesting. Stuff like that just I hated.
Yeah.
Sandman was literally, as far as I remember, Sandman was literally the first fantasy I ever read as an adult that I respected and that really grabbed me. And that was a real surprise, because, again, I thought Sandman was kind of a superhero. And so it really took some arm twisting for me to read that. And I've been real lucky over the years that people would either drag me to something or having that moment of someone handing me a book and saying, shut up, don't ask questions, just read this. And I kind of got that with Sandman. And encountering Gaiman for the first time was really terrific, was really career-changing. Like seeing those old paintings, like seeing Dali and Duchamp, reading Sandman really changed things for me. And now I'm pretty much a fantasy writer. I write a little bits of science fiction short stories, but 90% of my output's probably fantasy.
Now that's a very interesting statement, because a lot of times science fiction and fantasy get lumped together, and we share a lot of territory. The science fiction writers and the fantasy writers, but while there are lots of similarities, there's a real divide between the two. What do you think it is about that? Well, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's almost like when you're talking about and some people may not get this analogy, but when you're talking about graduating from Superman to Spider-Man and on, right. A lot of times we begin with some of this kind of safe science fiction, if you will, and go to some fantasy that allows us to deal with some darker topics and peel back the layers of the things that scare us. Or does that make sense at all? Like, how do you feel that evolution?
I think some of it's Ballardian. J.G. Ballard is one of the writers that's affected me deeply over the years. And he was very much a science fiction writer. But I think some of the things he talked about can be applied to both science fiction and fantasy. And he talked about, in his own work, was a reaction to a lot of the 50s science fiction of getting in muscular men getting in rocket ships and flying to other planets to do muscular, manly things. And he wrote a lot about psychology and stories that took place in people's heads that were very much the opposite of that big two-fisted science fiction of the 50s. And he talked about his stuff. The old stuff explored outer space. His stuff explored inner space. And I think that's also, to a degree, the divide a lot of times in a lot of contemporary science fiction, although less than it was, between, outward-looking versus inward-looking. I think there's more concern with the psychological still on the fantasy end of things. There's a lot of, which is not to put down science fiction, there's a lot of great science fiction these days that has both,
right?
Great science fictional ideas, great characters, and deals with the psychology of them. But especially when I was growing up, science fiction was still, the science fiction I grew up with was a lot of Asimov kind of writing, which is 90% idea, not a lot of deep characterization. And the idea of going into fantasy really was dealing with mythologies, dealing with folklore, dealing with the kind of beliefs that comes completely from human mind. I mean, that's the difference for me when I switched from science fiction to fantasy. It wasn't as big a leap as some people think, because in both sets of literature, you're talking about belief systems. That's always interested me. Belief systems in the scientific method and the rational on one side, and really the irrational in some ways on the fantasy side of things. And seeing the crossover and being interested in both belief systems is how I made that transition. And being able to use the tropes of older mythologies in contemporary work, which I saw some of in Sandman, changed the way I thought about writing. And it affected, even my science fiction, my second novel, which no one's ever seen, and probably for good reason. Kamikaze L'Amour was really affected by both Ballardian kind of science fiction, that sort of science and psychology, but also the South American magic realist writers who really are on that borderland between realist writing and fantasy, and then some contemporary fantasy type of fiction. And that was that book is a big bridge for me. It's like I said, most people haven't seen it. It's been out of print for years. I haven't looked at it in years. I'd have to go back. If some people have talked about reprinting it, I'd have to go back and read it to see if I could live with having that back in print. It's one of those weird books that in my mind I have a certain amount of affection for it, because it combines so many different elements of things I wanted to do. What I might do is a rewrite on the entire book and then release a revised, the quote unquote author's preferred text edition. But that was another changing moment for me, bringing those belief systems together in one piece of work, and trying, in its own way, with the fantasy I'm writing now to kind of acknowledge science. I mean, I worked a tiny bit of string theory into some bits of Sandman Slim, the idea of membranes, and not to get too close. There's a little string theory that's it doesn't label as string theory, and it's dropped in very quietly along the way. But there's a lot of stuff in the Sandman Slim books that most people don't pick up on or recognize. And it's fun every now and then when I get a letter from someone who's saying, "Is this what you were doing right here?" I was like, "Yeah, that's what I was doing."
That's great.
Because it's fun because you're writing that one thing. It helps the story. You're not being cute. It's necessary there, but you're also writing it for that those 10 people who are going to recognize this very specific aspect of it.
Right.
There's a lot of Kabbalistic stuff in Sandman Slim, which most people don't realize. And every now and then I get letters from students of that, and even rabbis have written me going, "Oh my God, did you really do this thing?" I'm like, "Yeah, that's what I was doing."
That's great. That's great.
That's really fun.
Yeah. You've also written some cyberpunk, I think, before you got to Sandman Slim.
That's back in my science fiction days, absolutely.
Yeah, which, sort of bridges some of that gap between the two. What was your... what was it about cyberpunk that intrigued you, and how did that book come about?
Well, again, it's talking about belief systems and moving, like Ballard, moving away from muscular 50s, giant computers, big rocket ships, super science, into something smaller and more tangible and more body-based. I mean, if you think of old science fiction as being, again, rocket ships, cyberpunk was more about technology impacting the body. Molly Millions in Neuromancer is the perfect characterization of that early cyberpunk, that idea of somebody who has accepted technology into her body in a way that didn't change who she was. The technology was an expression of who she already was. And it proved it. I mean, a lot of science and technology is a tangible expression of a desire. And that's what a lot of cyberpunk was about, was concretizing those desires, and a different worldview, and a more of expansive worldview, and looking at how other cultures and the politics of other societies and fringe groups in America was impacting science and culture at the time, and bringing all of that stuff together. It was about the edges of the world. The edges are where things are interesting. When you get to the center of any system, it's very stable and it's boring. So when you start moving out toward the edges, things get really interesting, whether it's science or literature or fantasy or religion or just personal human interactions. The further you get to the edge, that's where stuff is interesting, and that's where cyberpunk started out. And then you have someone like Gibson who's taken it to such remarkable places. I mean, his stuff now, if you compare his newer stuff to Neuromancer, they don't look alike at all, but I think they're completely connected. If you think about it below the surface, they are absolutely the same mind, looking at the world in remarkable ways. Gibson, I still think, is brilliant. Sterling is still brilliant in a very different way. Those two from the old school cyberpunk writing are still really solid writers.
Yeah. Well, and they understand what they're writing about, so that as the technology morphs and grows, so does their view of it, which I think is important.
Yeah. And for me, my first cyberpunk novel, Metrophage, I was sort of second generation cyberpunk. So those Gibson, Sterling, Lou Shiner, Pat Cadigan were already, John Shirley were already established. And we were kind of bouncing off some of their stuff and bringing different elements in. And for me, having spent a lot of time in LA and being fascinated with LA, and also having grown up, there's a certain amount of criminal connections in my past. I mean, I've known different kinds of criminals when I was growing up, and so those elements kind of crept into my cyberpunk. The idea of just the idea of decay is something that that's fascinated me. It's the idea of decay, crime, and the future of Los Angeles, which is almost a fantasy story on its own. LA is a whole belief system in its own right. Where, in that people go there to be exposed to LA magic and then become a superstar, whether it's art, literature, movies, TV, music. And so writing about LA is always writing about fantasy and bringing all that into Metrophage and trying to stir that all up. And, I got this weird little book out of it. And it's very much a young man's book. It was my first novel. It's the language is somebody who is young and showing off. So there's a lot of convoluted writing that I don't do anymore. A million ideas per page.
Right.
That's the funny thing. When you're that first novel, you're so desperately afraid of losing anyone's interest. You just pile stuff on. Every single page has an explosion or an idea or an image or something crazy going on, to the point it kind of makes me laugh now. But you have to respect it too, because there are people who like the book. It's had a little cult following now for 20 years, and Harper Voyager brought it back into print last year, and it's really fun to see it back out there in the world again. But I wouldn't let them reprint it without doing an introduction to put the book in context, because it's old enough now. Bits of it look creaky, and I wanted to explain it as the work of a young man who was learning who he was, but also dealing with mental problems. A lot of my younger life, in my 20s and my early 30s, was dealing with depression and manic depression. And I think that's in the text, and I also think it's why I wrote certain things, and it's also why there were gaps in the early part of my career. And I wanted to talk about real things, like how hard it is to write a book, how weird it is to write that first book, but also admitting, hey, depression affects your life and your career, and you have to do something about it. So I used to hide that stuff, but now I'm very happy to talk about dealing with mental illness and trying to get past it.
That's awesome. And it's great to look back on things sometimes, to really appreciate how you've grown and how different you are now, and to see how those bad situations actually informed who you are now. It's great when you it's kind of like I heard B.B. King say one time that the space between the notes was probably more important than the notes that you played, and that's one of those things that you mature as a writer. You learn that you don't have to put 5 explosions on every page. Sometimes allowing the characters to breathe a little bit is important. But
yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying exactly. You don't have to explain every single object around every single character to make them interesting. It's like learning those few. Again, we're back to sort of journalism and brevity. Learning those a handful of clues to who a character is. They walk into a bar. What do they order? Okay, that order is going to tell you something about them. Do they order, PBR? Or do they order some really expensive foreign beer? That's a clue to who those characters are, because they could be ordering PBR because they like cheap beer, but they could be ordering it because they're young and ironic. And each thing is a clue. The guy who orders expensive beer may be rich, and he grew up rich, but maybe he's being pretentious. Maybe he's trying to pretend to be rich. Little things like that you can just drop in and then build on as the story goes along.
Something changed in your writing or in your career around 2010. when Sandman Slim came onto the scene. Where did he come from, and did this kind of solidify that switch for you over into fantasy?
Very much. Sandman Slim really nailed me down as a fantasy writer, which I'd already been going toward. But, I mean, because my previous novel was Butcher Bird, which was my first full-on, hey, I'm writing a fantasy book. But Sandman Slim, where did it come from? Well, on the most literal explanation I can give you is when I finished up Butcher Bird, and I had one more novel I tried to do that didn't work. So I was looking around for my next project, and like every writer, I had piles of notebooks with all your stupid ideas and scenes in them. And I found two notebooks, one of which there was literally one sentence in each notebook. One was Hitman from Hell, and the other, in a different notebook, said character name Sandman Slim. And for some reason, after all those years, those things hooked up in my mind. And, you know, there was some worry on my part of having Sandman in a character's name. After all, Gaiman is so famous for it. But I thought that I could make mine, if I could nail down who Sandman Slim was, James Stark, who's Sandman Slim, very quickly, it would differentiate the two, and people would understand the difference, and would understand that Sandman comes from the old pulp tradition of the idea of a murderer. It was a nickname for a hitman, was the Sandman. And those two things, those two sentences led to the entire series. I started playing with, what does this mean, Hitman from Hell, Sandman Slim? Is he literally a hitman? Is he an old mobster that went to hell and is now coming back? It's like, well, that sounds kind of boring to write about. A literal hitman. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, what if he's someone who fell into it? He's a reluctant killer, but he is a killer. Okay, how do you become a reluctant killer? Well, you're forced into it because of your circumstances in hell. What happened to you? How did you get to hell? And then, because the book is also about someone escaping hell, you have to start asking the next set of questions. Well, here's a guy who's been in hell for 11 years. He escapes back to L.A. What's the first thing you do? You have to figure that out, man. What's the first thing you do? Where's the first place you go? Do you have any friends? Where do you sleep that night? I'm back from hell. I don't know what's going on in the world. What are those simple things that have to happen for that character? And working that out, it's almost an anthropology project, you know, the way, not anthropology, archaeology in a way, where somebody finds a potsherd and puts a pot back together. Hey, look, we have a pot. Well, from the pot, you can figure out it's used this way. And from the reason, and the fact they have this kind of pot means this was a kitchen, and from a kitchen, it's this kind of house. And for that kind of house means it's this part of a town. And so you keep expanding from these tiny elements. And that's the way it worked for me with Sandman Slim. I created a whole world from two sentences.
Wow. That's you talked about taking mythologies and kind of exploring those and looking at how those affect us. Sandman Slim has definitely has some deep-rooted mythologies that you explore, but also is anchored in a very real, or at least real to me, Los Angeles. And talk about the kind of comparing those two, or merging those two. That you've got these fantastical elements, you've got these topics that all of us are familiar with in some way, but with the kind of weird fantasy setting of an actual place that is fantasy.
Well, I think this goes back to my childhood and the idea of seeing Dali and Duchamp. And I was living in New York, and my brain was switched on in a real city. And New York has a very strong personality. So the idea of seeing both the fantastic and the mundane in the same place at the same time made perfect sense to me. And I love LA. I love writing about LA. And so to put this particular story in LA, where you have tremendous amounts of fantasy material in a story in which people are also trying to be movie stars and people are drinking too much and behaving badly, it made perfect sense to me that I could see all these things coexisting. It made LA for me, is sort of the perfect place to put a fantasy story, because it is a very ephemeral city. It is a city it's based on desire. It's based on dreams. It's based on, hope and anger and fear and ghosts. It's a city of vampires and ghosts. The people who come there to become famous, the vampires who prey on them, psychologically and in terms of money and their career, bad agents, bad people, bad relationships. And then you have the ghosts who are the broken people who came there to be something else, but it didn't work out. And you see both the ghosts and the vampires in Hollywood, especially, all the time. People who wanted to be more than they are, and the people who preyed on them and kept them from becoming more than they are. So the city already had those fantastical elements to me, and being in LA in the 80s also brought that element to me. The old punk scene, weird art going around, Hollywood in the 80s, and was just crazy. It was a madhouse, and it was a fun place to be. And so it was very easy to imagine angels and demons walking around with the tourists eating their ice cream cones and wearing their dumb, Hollywood T-shirts.
That's awesome. Sandman Slim deals with some really dark and hard subject matter, and the character of Sandman Slim is not a perfect protagonist. How do you keep growing his character arc, and but kind of maintaining his imperfections? And I guess what I'm asking is, how do you keep an audience loving this character when sometimes he's not very lovable at all?
It was really important for me to have him change over the course of the books. But the fact is, James Stark, who is Sandman Slim, has a particular worldview that over the course of the series is going to change somewhat and soften somewhat. But at the same time, psychologically, he's never going to be a nice guy completely. I mean, he may get healthier psychologically, but he's never going to be someone who's going to go and do Pilates or a yoga class. I mean, it's just not in his nature.
Well, he begins in hell. So
the book literally opens with him coming out of hell on fire,
right.
Like literally on fire in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. That's how he starts out in the world. That will color your point of view, your image of Earth. The whole idea of the series really was the rehabilitation of a monster, because in the first book, Sandman Slim, Stark really is a genuine monster. He's just come back from hell. He's been there for 11 years. All he wants is revenge. And he is furious and angry and destructive all the way through the book. And it all has to do with his mistakes that got him sent to hell and that got his girlfriend killed. He is back for revenge on the people who sent him to hell and murdered his girlfriend. And he is a madman who will do anything to achieve that goal. At the same time, as hard as it is for him to deal with, he ends up saving the world. And he hates himself for it, but he ends up saving the world. And over the course of the series, he reconnects with his own humanity in certain ways, and it's very slow, and it's a very painful process for him. But I had to have him get back into the world, become more of a human being again. And I wanted to see that. But again, he will become more of a human and more, I don't know how you define likable. But he's going to be someone that you're going to see, you have seen, care more about people. But again, he's only going to go so far. I mean, he's even admitted he has a friend named Allegra who's a doctor, and she keeps talking to him about PTSD. You spent 11 years in hell. You have PTSD, whether you want to admit it or not. And he's finally admitted it. He actually sat down in a book, Killing Pretty, which I believe is the 8th book in the series, or the 7th book. Okay, I lose count sometimes. But in Killing Pretty, it's the first time he acknowledges, okay, I probably have PTSD. What do you do about that? And he's tried that more than once, and what always happens, him being who he is, something awful happens that stops him cold. Someone gets murdered. Something terrible shows up. And so every time he tries to want to become a better, nicer person, something comes along that needs him to be a monster again, to kill, to be ruthless in tracking things down. Killing Pretty was a book that dealt with contemporary fascism. Killing Pretty was an interesting one for me because there's more reality of LA and the history of LA than any other book I've ever written. That was really a fun book for me. But then carrying on from there, Stark has to of his own life. He has to deal with the consequences of what's happened in hell, what's happened in heaven, and he ends up saving the world and his friends' lives, because at a certain point it's not a mistake anymore. It is deliberate. He cares about people. He falls in love at a certain point, and that really rocks his worldview. He's in love with a woman named Candy, who isn't human. She is a jade, and I invented the jades because I didn't want to use vampires in the book, and I wanted to come up with something that's worse than a vampire. And the jades are a species, a fantasy species, that they don't drink the blood of their victims. They're a bit more like spiders in that they basically inject an enzyme into their victims and let them dissolve and then drink their insides. Candy is sort of a reformed jade who doesn't do that anymore. But she's still a monster, like Stark. I mean, the two monsters saw something in each other and could trust each other in ways they couldn't trust regular people. So trying to play with all those elements, it gets complicated, but I'm having a good time trying to, like I said, rehabilitate a monster, but not make him, I keep saying, I don't want to make him too nice, but the fact is, Stark is a real character for me at this point. He's only going to be himself at this point. I mean, I've written 9 books. I know who Stark is, and I know who Stark wants to be. He's going to go so far in being a nice guy, and then he won't be able to go any further. And I think he will also always be a loyal, good friend to the people he cares about, but always capable of being a monster to people he considers monstrous.
Right. You mentioned earlier that in Sandman Slim you have touched on everything from string theory to Kabbalah and everything in between. Do you find things that just intrigue you and fascinate you and say, I'd like to, this aspect of this mythology really is kind of weird and I like this about it. Kind of like you talked earlier about the center of things is boring, but when you get out to the fringes, that's where things get exciting and things like that. Kind of how do you find these things to explore? Are these just things that you've encountered throughout your life, or kind of what's the process for weaving these different mythologies?
Yeah, I did a lot of reading before I started writing Sandman Slim. I have an entire library devoted to hell and the devil, and I have a smaller library devoted to heaven, and a sort of medium-sized one devoted to just religions of the world. So I read a lot of this stuff, and mythology, and read a lot of this stuff. So a lot of it was already in my head, because there is Kabbalistic stuff, there's a bunch of Christian stuff, there's a bunch of Gnostic stuff, there's old, world mythologies. All these things get mixed together. And a lot of it was stuff that I already knew that as I was writing the stories came together in different ways. I'm a big believer in using the unconscious when you're writing. So having as much weird stuff in my brain as possible when I go in to write the books makes the books easier to write. So I didn't have to sit around going, what's a weird thing I can put in here? I already knew some odd thing that would connect with this aspect of the story. Some of the Gnostic aspects of who God is in the Sandman Slim series. A lot of it comes from Kabbalistic stuff, but also Gnosticism. God's story is pretty Gnostic, and again, sort of writers telling themselves jokes and telling jokes to a few handful of readers. God hates the Gnostics because they hit a little too close to home for him. So my character of God really doesn't like Gnostics. He finds them a real pain in the ass. And that's just a little thing that makes me laugh, and a handful of other people. Again, it's not necessary for anybody else. It won't stop you in the story, but it's fun. It's little fun things like that I think if I can amuse myself, I can amuse other people. So just, I think it's a lot of prep work. I think before you're going to jump into these big projects, I want to say do your homework, but it's not homework. It's fun. Prepare for it. It's like a lot of Japanese painting. I don't know how to pronounce it, sumi or sumi painting. There'll be this long lead up to the painting where you grind the pigments and you get the brushes just right and you get the water set up. And then you have everything is a long process of preparation. And then the actual painting itself is very fast. And I think that's the way the writing of Sandman Slim is to me. There's a lot of lead up to the actual writing. And then I try and do at least the first draft as quickly as possible with all that stuff in my head, so that it's all kind of fresh and in there, and then I can go back and fix things later. And I recommend that for everybody, especially starting out. Get that first draft done. Whatever you have to do to write the first draft, because you can always get to fix stuff. Nobody has to see your terrible first draft.
That's right. You mentioned something just a minute ago, and when I first discovered your writing, and my friend Trey turned me on to it, but shout out to Trey. When I first got into it, one thing that I was not really prepared for is how freaking funny Stark is, and how much humor you have woven into these books. It's really dark subject matter, really heinous things happening sometimes, but at the same time, it's really kind of funny. How important is that for you to bring a little levity into some of these stories?
I think the only way dark stories work is with some humor, at least for me. And when I was telling Sandman Slim, I realized very early on I have to allow him to have a sense of humor, because some of the things he does are so awful, and some of the things he encounters are so awful that you have to break up those moments of horror with something. Give people a chance to breathe. And I think it also plays into who Stark is, that if you've ever met cops, if you've ever met EMTs, the first thing you will see from them is they have the darkest, most messed up senses of humor of anybody. A terrible, bloody crime scene, you will hear the funniest things coming out of cops' mouths. Same thing with EMT people. You will hear them tell the funniest stories about the most horrendous accidents or or whatever, whatever terrible situation they come into where there's a crazy person or a lot of blood around, they have a very dark sense of humor. And I realized with Stark early on that Stark, having been in hell for 11 years, starting out as kind of a cocky bastard, ending up in hell, that he would end up with a dark sense of humor. And I also realized it in terms of how to tell a story that's this dark and violent. The fact is, the very first version of Sandman Slim, like the first 100 pages I wrote, when I first tried it, were not funny. And I read them over again, and I realized, I hate this. I would never want to read this book. But then the moment I let Stark be funny, the moment I let Stark have his own voice and be funny in it, the book worked. And I realized you can have a lot of decapitations as long as they're funny decapitations.
Right.
And that's part of this. That's part of the secret of how Stark works. As long as there's some little bit of humor he can drag out of the most vile situations, he's going to be okay. And I think it's basic to his psychology that he has to be able to disrespect the most awful things he encounters. To let the awfulness of the universe be awful gives it power over you. And the moment you can make fun of it, you take your power back. And that's what Stark does.
The latest Sandman Slim novel is called The Perdition Score, came out in June of last year, and you've recently turned in the latest book, which will come out in June of this year. How far do you envision Sandman Slim going?
I'm not going to tell you. There is
Okay.
an end. There is an end coming, but there are a few more books to get there. I want it to kind of be a surprise for people to see the shape of the story. When we get there, I want people to understand the shape of the story and what I was going for. So I'm not going to tell you how many books, but you might be able to guess. And if you get the right answer, I'm still not going to tell you if you're right. I want everybody to come along together. But after the whole series is over, I will discuss all this. But I did want an end point. I didn't want to write 50 books and have people sick of Stark.
Right.
You don't want to be the last person to leave the party. So I wanted to leave at a point in which people still liked the character and still wanted more. Because, maybe when I stop the thing, I'll want to come back to it in a few years, the way Richard Stark did with his Parker novels. He wrote 15 of them, I think, and then stopped for years and then came back later on and had another successful run because people still remembered those old books with affection, and I hope I can do that with Stark. There is a shape to the whole story, and you will see it when it's over. And I just turned in the newest book, the very, 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 very last changes, literally last week, which is incredibly late. It's the latest I've ever been with the book. I apologize to everyone in the world, especially my publisher, in having a book this late. But there was a lot of, when I did the first draft, and I realized I wanted to change a very fundamental element, and that required a complete rewrite from beginning to end to change this one psychological element throughout the book. So that was a long process. But the new book, The Kill Society, is done. It's in. There's a cover for it. And it'll be going out for reviews soon, and it'll be out on June 6th.
Nice. You do have something exciting that's actually debuting this week as this episode drops, and that is your new run on the Lucifer comic for Vertigo. I was excited to see that.
I was excited for it to happen. I'm really thrilled. I wrote some comics back in the early 2000s, and it was very unsuccessful. But I learned a bit about comic writing, and I've wanted to get back into comics ever since. And I will be eternally indebted to Holly Black, because she picked up Lucifer after Mike Carey, because Carey had stopped writing it, and it was
Yeah.
gone for a while. Holly Black is the person through Vertigo who picked up the story and brought it back and did a great run on it. And when she was done, when they asked, like, okay, your run is over, who do you think should take over? She gave them my
How
name.
cool.
And they came to me. We talked, and it was a very quick transition. I said yes pretty much immediately, to my agent's chagrin. It was the first time I've ever accepted a job without talking to her first. But when they said, oh, you could take this over, and I just said yes. Absolutely, I will take over Lucifer. I love the series. I love the Mike Carey series. I love Holly Black's series, and I'm hoping I can carry on their tradition and do something really new, but respecting the history of who Lucifer is. It's really great character and a really great world to play with.
Can you give us any little clue as to what you're going to do different with the character?
Well, one of the things that Holly did in her run was she wanted to go back to the beginning of Lucifer and bring in all the different worlds and realms that Lucifer lived in. So you're going back to dream world, you're going back to hell after Lucifer had abandoned all these places. When I took over, one of the things we discussed is because Lucifer came back from the void, back to Los Angeles, for my run to really center Lucifer in Los Angeles. So it's a book set in a very specific place at a very specific time. So I really want Lucifer and all his other characters interacting with the real world as much as possible. We still go to hell. We still go to heaven, because Mazikeen has a lot of business to do in hell, and there's a lot of crazy stuff happening in heaven right now. But we're staying mostly in Los Angeles and dealing with things in the real world, as crazy as they get.
Nice. I'm going to grab a copy of it when it comes out this week. I'm excited. Richard, thank you so much for.
We have some new characters, and I think people will find fun and awful. Fun and awful.
We look forward to it. Richard, thank you for being so generous with your time tonight. Where can people follow you to get plugged into your work?
I am on Twitter, Richard_Kadrey, and you can find me on Facebook at Richard Kadrey. And I have a richardkadrey.com, my website, but I haven't updated it for a while because we're going to redo the whole thing. But yeah, you can find me there too. And all the news will come through Twitter and Facebook. Those are two really good places.
All right, I'll put links to all that in the show notes. Richard, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for asking me. It's great.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. Join me each Tuesday and Friday at hankgarner.com for a new episode. Thanks for listening.